Hello and welcome to Just Onside. We're shooting on Friday, just before the game. So before I ask Uwais how he is, I'm going to ask the viewers. I hope they're well, because I never really sort of speak to the viewers. But I hope you're all doing fantastically well. Uwais, I hope the viewers are doing fantastically well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. As you mentioned, we're recording Friday evening. I think it's currently 5:43 p.m. Long week with work. Really need this weekend just to recalibrate. And looking forward to the Premier League action. So I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Excellent, excellent. It's always a good feeling on a Friday after a tough week of work. So I'm looking forward to the weekend. I'm quite excited with what's happened with Leeds as well. But let's not talk about Leeds. This is a Premier League show, so let's move on to all things Premier League. But before we talk about all things Premier League, let's talk about Fantasy Premier League. It's something that it's a league that we've created as well, just onside. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you that have joined the league. I think there's about 64 that have joined the league. So absolutely fantastic. We're absolutely thrilled to bits by the support. We were going to try and record shows on a Thursday where perhaps Uwais could give tips on what he thinks will be good picks. But I'm not too sure about that because at the moment Uwais is, I think, 54th in the league. So maybe it may not be a great idea. But what we will do is, I mean, obviously it's going to be too late, but I'm going to give Uwais the floor. He's obviously going to talk about it because in the past he has been successful, albeit that was quite distant past. But let's give him the credit that he deserves. And he is obviously somebody who's finished second in the World League. So Uwais, take it away, my friend.
No, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I probably need to take heed from the tips myself and pay a little bit more attention because I've not started well. Let's just say that, and maybe that's got something to do with the fact that I've not got Erling Haaland in my team. So that's a bold decision there in and of itself. But you're absolutely right, Ayub. The main thing is it's a little bit of fun, and a big thank you to everyone who's joined the Just Onside League. Ayub, you've joined as well, although you did miss a week. Real commitment to the cause there, missing a week. But no, it's
I'm not bottom. So I'm not sure who is bottom, but whoever is, I hope they joined a week later as well. Because if they joined at the start of the first game week, then they're doing awfully poor.
Absolutely. But no, you're absolutely right. We're going to cover a few things and we will be doing this absolutely regularly from now on. I think there's obviously a game next Friday, but we'll be shooting on Thursday. So hopefully the episode will be released in readiness well in advance of the transfer deadline for FPL next week. And thereafter, we've got a number of game weeks where the first game of the game week is on a Saturday. So we shouldn't have any issues whatsoever. But in any event, we'll be recording on Thursday, hopefully looking to drop the episode Thursday night, giving dedicated FPL managers plenty of time just to, it's just kick around some thoughts. That's what we're here for. But I did want to give a little bit of a summary, if I may, mainly around a Just Onside league. So, as you rightly mentioned, I'm on page 2 of the table. So I've got,
or in my case, scrolling it. My finger's quite sore by the time I get to your name.
Exactly, but you must be used to it. Often checking where Leeds are. No, but all good. But let's have a little bit of a quick summary. So, who's top of our Just Onside league? Well, it's a team named Power Striker. With 153 points in total. That gentleman manager's name is Hallelujah James. Now, I'm not sure if that's the real name, but maybe it is the real name. And credit to you. 2 weeks in, top of the Just Onside league with 153 points, followed closely by Galacticos at 145 points, and Rice Baby also at 145 points. But no, Power Striker, overall rank, Ayub, of 33,750. So that's in the world. That's a world rank. So very impressive. I think we've got about 9.5 million participants in the overall game so far. What's Power Striker done well? Well, had a very strong first week. Interesting, I did do a bit of analysis on the team. Probably spent more time analysing that team than I have been my own team. Maybe that's where the problem lies. But very interestingly, there are some interesting snippets. Opting for a 3-4-3 formation in both game weeks, the defense and goalkeeper for Power Striker has got points in every single position in every single game. So what I mean is, in terms of the 3 defenders and the goalkeeper that Hallelujah James has fielded, they've all picked up points. On total, his defense and goalkeeper has picked up in total across the 2 game weeks 62 points. So that's an average of 31 points a game week, just coming from the back line and goalkeeper. Some interesting points here. He's got Areola and Onana as goalkeepers. They are both the highest selected goalkeepers in the game. If you remember, he had Onana in the first game, where Onana was probably a little fortuitous. If you remember, could have, I don't think it was a red card, but definitely would have had a penalty against him. Maybe will score, he loses the clean sheet. And in the second game with Areola, loses the clean sheet against Chelsea, but gets a crucial penalty save, and a penalty save from Enzo Fernandez, as you'll remember. So that's +5 points. So getting a lot of points. You need a little bit of luck, but equally, he's done the right thing in terms of having that flexibility of goalkeepers. What you don't want, what you often find, is teams will play or opt for one goalkeeper and have a real bench for of a goalkeeper who doesn't play for his regular team. But having Areola, who's now secured the top goalkeeping spot for West Ham, it seems, at 4 million, I believe, and Onana at 5 million. That's 9 million across 2 goalkeepers, especially one of those playing for a team that'll be playing in the Champions League, so a top team in Manchester United. So he's done well there. The big contributors for him has been Estupiñán for Brighton. He's the highest selected defender in the overall game, comfortably ahead of the second place, which is Trippier. So Estupiñán is selected by 64% of teams. Trippier is selected by 31% of teams. He's also got Haaland. Ayub, do you want to guess how many teams in the Fantasy Premier League have selected Erling Haaland?
I have a feeling that it's probably about 60 out of 64.
I mean, in the overall game. So as a percentage
I see.
Out of the 9.5 million teams, let's say, what's the percentage of teams that have Erling Haaland as a striker?
85%.
Try 91. So
91%.
Yeah, so 9 of every 10 teams have Erling Haaland, and why wouldn't you? And that's, if you remember, we discussed the drop-off in price, right? After Erling Haaland, there's very much a dearth of top strikers at clubs. You've got Jesus coming back at Arsenal, but even he, I think, priced around 8.5 million, I believe. So Haaland, 91.3, he's got him. He captained him in the first game against Burnley, so he picked up a couple of goals for him there. Like I said, he's got Onana and Areola as goalkeepers. He's also got Saka, who's the highest selected midfielder in the overall game, 66.6%. But again, you'd probably expect that in terms of Saka, because he's still of a decent value. But yeah, he's done really well in terms of, he's got a couple of issues, I think, this week. Shaw, I think, has just been announced that he's going to miss a couple of months for United, so he may need to make a substitute there. But on the whole, very good. Another major contributor, Ayub Wissa at Brentford. He was one that we looked at, if you remember, because of the Ivan Toney ban. He had a bit of a I would say he was a bit of a super sub for Brentford, wasn't he, last year? He kept popping up with some crucial goals. Interesting. And I think this year he's obviously contributed with a goal and a couple of assists and what have you. 2 goals and an assist, I should say, and some bonuses. So he's been a big contributor for Power Strike as well. So big congratulations to Hallelujah James, doing well, flying high. I've got a long way to go to get even remotely close. So I've got a bit slow, small building blocks for myself maybe to get back up to the top of the Just Onside League. But yeah, big well done to him. I do want to just give a quick, maybe a few shout outs. And you're right, this episode will probably drop by the time the deadline passes. But next week, when we're right back on track, it'll be interesting to circle back to these predictions. So I want to go through a couple of quick options for this week in terms of players that I think are must-haves or who will go big this week. I think players to maybe avoid, and maybe a bit of a wild card, just looking at the fixtures themselves. So player to must have. I mean, go on, I'll throw it to you. Which player do you think, looking at the fixtures this week, go on quickly, what do you think? Which player do you think is going to fire this game week? Go on.
I think Haaland. I think they're playing Sheffield United, aren't they? So really, I've made him captain. I think many people probably made him captain. So Haaland for me. I wish I had I wish I had one of the Chelsea strikers. I mean, I'm not sure who's playing today, but they're playing Luton. And I'm saying it now that they will score double figures. Chelsea will beat Luton by double figures.
one of the reasons why we started this podcast was to share our genuine and authentic views. But there are times when Ayub just drifts into that clickbait narrative.
I am telling you now. I mean, obviously, it's an hour or so before the game kicks off. But it will be, because Luton, I've told you, Luton, you know what Luton's plan is for this season. They've hardly improved. It's a championship side against quite an exciting, thrilling side. So double figures. You heard it here first.
Double figures. Wow. No, I mean, so the player to have, you're absolutely right. Erling Haaland, there's a reason why 91% of teams have him in. Sheffield United, another promoted club. It's away from home, but you expect Haaland, with the creativity that he's got behind him, irrespective of De Bruyne's injuries. You're absolutely right. I've gone for Nicholas Jackson. I think Jackson will break his... he'll score his first Premier League goal, I think, today against Luton. Luton conceded plenty against Brighton. I think it was in the first game of the season. Obviously, they then had the second game called off because of construction work at Kenilworth Road. But I do fancy Chelsea, you're right, to put a few past them tonight. I've got a few friends going to the game as well. But it should be I do expect... And we slightly disagreed, didn't we, Ayub, on the performance that Chelsea had against West Ham. I thought it was... on the whole, still lots of positive signs. Sterling looked amazing for the most part of the game. And I think Jackson's definitely got the qualities and the attributes to be a top-class striker. The key question for any striker is, do you score enough goals? So I think he breaks his duck today for Chelsea, and I think he'll score quite a few for Chelsea. So I'm going to go for Nicholas Jackson as the player to have for this game week. I do think he'll contribute big time. A few players to avoid. I just want to get your thoughts. Bournemouth play Spurs this weekend, and I suggest that defenders from either team I would avoid. Last year, if you remember, Ayub, both games were absolute crackers. Spurs coming back to win 3-2 at Bournemouth, and then Bournemouth reversing that 3-2 at the Spurs Stadium, famously. So 10 goals between the teams last year. Both teams have scored in both games this season. Spurs 2-2 against Brentford to open up, then obviously beating Manchester United 2-0, Bournemouth 1-1 West Ham, and then scoring at Anfield. And let's be honest, gave a good account of themselves at Anfield for the most part. So I fancy both teams to score, which means that clean sheets will be gone. So I don't fancy any defenders from either team from Tottenham, Bournemouth. I think both teams will score. And the player I've gone as a wild card, I don't know if I'll give you a bit of time maybe to think about any wild cards that you've got in mind, are you? But the wild card I've gone for...
Forget wild cards. I'm trying to do Jackson now. While you're speaking.
If you've got Nicholas Jackson in your team next week...
How much is he, if you don't mind me asking?
I don't know. I've forgotten. I'm not sure.
But, I mean, this is interactive at its best.
At its best.
I'm the only one who's probably going to benefit from this.
I mean, it's hardly breaking news that Chelsea are going to score a few against Luton, you would imagine, right? But the wild card I'm going to go for is Zeki Amdouni for Burnley. And the reason being is that Burnley, if you remember, gave a pretty decent account of themselves at Turf Moor against the champions of Europe, Manchester City. He had a few moments, did Zeki Amdouni, the Swiss international. He was playing up front in a 5-4-1 formation. He played 61 minutes, looked threatening on the whole. I mean, you don't create many chances against Manchester City, but for what it's worth, I think he looked fairly threatening. It'll be interesting to see where he plays, whether he plays up front, whether he plays behind Foster or what have you. So it'll be interesting to see how Company sets up. But Burnley obviously skipped a week because they were scheduled to play Luton. So they had a free week. They did play a behind closed doors friendly against Manchester United at Carrington, 1-3-0. Manchester United only had a few kind of what I would call relative first team squad players: Pellistri, Martial, I think Donny van der Beek, Johnny Evans, and a few others. Scott McTominay, I think, also played. But they won 3-0. He scored as well, Zeki Amdouni. So I'm just kind of interested, according to the reports that I've read, I just fancy him. It's home to Villa. And I think he's got a fairly decent fixture next week as well. But I do fancy him just because Villa obviously took a bit of a tonking in the first game away to Newcastle. I'm interested to see with Tyrone Mings out injured. Yes, they had a bounce back win against Everton, but Everton probably going to have a tough season this year, you would imagine. So I'm interested to see how Villa cope away from Burnley. Burnley have had a bit of time off. Not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing early on in the season. You probably want to get your fitness levels up. But I fancy Zeki Amdouni. I fancy Burnley to maybe get a positive result, whether that's a draw or a win. And I just fancy him maybe just to get something. And Burnley looked, I don't know what your thoughts were, but they looked tidy against City for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely right. I think from last season, you just knew that they're probably obviously going to still struggle. But there's enough quality. I think Vincent Kompany's done a terrific job. He's bought some really, really good players. So I think you're right. I mean, it'll be interesting. This is the good thing. I'm looking forward to the weekend and sort of looking at your predictions.
Well, I'm sure you'll call me up on it next week, and that was the idea of doing these, even though it won't benefit anyone. Hopefully, it benefits you. But and not that it means much, but it'll be good to circle back next week just to see how these tips aged. Let's say so. Hopefully that's good. But some tips there. I think Zeki Amdouni, I fancy him. I don't know why. Just a few little things in the background. But yeah, Bournemouth Spurs to be a score draw or goals to be scored in that game, so I'd avoid defenders. And Nicholas Jackson he's a dead cert. I have to believe he's a dead cert today.
Well, if he ain't going to score today, he's never going to score.
Well, maybe home to Sheffield United, maybe. But let's see.
Good stuff. I mean, that's the Fantasy Premier League, but now onto the English Premier League. A weekend of football. It starts today. Chelsea versus Luton. In terms of games, I mean, personally, for me, I think the only game that really stands out, the mouth-watering game, is at the on Sunday. That's Newcastle versus Liverpool. Is there any other games that really stand out, or is that the game for you that you want to focus on?
Well, I think from a neutral's perspective, it probably is the game, isn't it? And that's why it's on Super Sunday at 4:30. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, looking at the fixture list, I think that is the big one. At least for my liking. Like I said, I think Bournemouth Spurs will be a cracker. But in terms of heavyweights, that's probably the game. How do you see it coming along at St. James's? Like you said, both teams, I mean, just very quickly, Ayub, Newcastle starting off with City and Liverpool, 2 out of the first 3. Liverpool starting with Chelsea and Newcastle, 2 out of the first 3. So a win for either side puts them in a fairly, I won't say good position, but they'll be happy. If Liverpool win, that's 7 points out of the first 3. They'll have taken that at the start, and if Newcastle win, that'll be 6 points with a tough narrow defeat at the Etihad last time out. How do you see the game faring, Ayub? What are your thoughts?
I mean, firstly, I'm really looking forward to it. Historically, Newcastle Liverpool games have always been exciting. I think it's probably going to be a slightly tighter affair. It's not going to be as expansive as games before. Crucial for Liverpool is McAllister. I think the fact that the red card has been rescinded is absolutely crucial. He's been excellent since he's joined Liverpool. So tight affair. I think for me it's going to be Liverpool. I think they're just going to edge it. I think there's just enough quality, especially going forward. I think the middle of the park as well now with the addition of the player, the Japanese player that they've got. I think that it just gives them that sort of solidity. I think a lot of Liverpool fans were slightly disappointed with Caicedo, with Lavia not coming, but I think, in all honesty, I think this is all they needed. No point spending 90 million, 100 million, 50 million, 60 million. Really, it's a solid pro that you need in the middle of the park who does the dirty work and gives it to the creative players. I think it's a good signing. I think with what they have in the middle of the park, what they have going forward, I think they'll just edge it. But it's going to be a game that I'm looking forward to. And it's always, as I said, Newcastle, Liverpool is always an exciting fixture. But for me, Liverpool, just by the odd goal.
You're right about the game in terms of what it represents, and it's a big credit to Newcastle, isn't it? In terms of the amazing turnaround of that club. When you think about where they were going under Mike Ashley, and now under obviously new ownership, but they've not spent vast sums of money. They've methodically built that club, that playing squad, and bought some really smart players along the way. Brought some through as well, but just some clever signings. Just when you think about real proper pros as well in terms of that workmanlike ethic, Trippier, Guimaraes, Joe Linton, even Dan Burn. There's a real kind of work ethic. They're an incredibly hard-working team. But yeah, I, like you, see Liverpool just edging it. You'll remember famously last year, Liverpool had one of their best results, winning 2-0 away from home at Newcastle.
Mm.
Early goals from Nunes and Gakpo, beautiful goals as well, both very different. 1-2 by Gakpo to make it 2-0 Nunes. Beautiful ball by Trent Alexander-Arnold over the top. Then you'll remember Nick Pope getting the red card from the long ball from Alisson, with Salah bearing down. And the game was pretty much done and dusted, although Newcastle, to their credit, played actually very well with 10 men and created the better opportunities, you would imagine, you would think, if you watched the rest of the game. So I do fancy Liverpool just because they do have an incredible attack and midfield. Dominic Szoboszlai had a fantastic game against Bournemouth. If you look at the statistics, dribbles, sprints, he was number one in all of those, ahead of any even touches, I think, ahead of Robertson. So, yeah, I fancy Liverpool. Big credit to Newcastle. They've got themselves into these conversations in terms of like the big games, getting the Super Sunday billing from Sky. But yeah, just very interested to see how this game goes. The key one you mentioned, will Liverpool opt to play Endo in the middle of the park in that number 6 position? McAllister's obviously free to play after the red card ban was overturned. Konate is missing. Klopp's confirmed that. So maybe Matip gets a play out. So yeah, very interested to see if Liverpool opt for their Gakpo in midfield, because that might be an area that Newcastle want to take advantage of. I fancy they might just go for a more kind of with defensive midfield, like you mentioned, Endo. He talked about how he's not quite ready to start yet, but I feel like he might just start, and then he just opts for maybe Diaz, who's had a great start to the season, Jota, and Salah. Also, a little bit of an interesting subplot with Salah, the Saudi Pro League, again, public investment fund for Saudi Arabia, which are the ultimate owners of Newcastle. They obviously supporting Al Ittihad in their bid to secure Salah. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, Ayub, but that could be a real game changer for the Premier League if Salah moves on. But there's a little bit of that in the air with the game as well. But yeah, it should be an absolutely fascinating game, and one that I'm incredibly looking forward to. But again, I have it 3-1 to Liverpool, just because I think it'll be a game of football. I think it'll be a very entertaining game of football. I think Liverpool might just be a tad more clinical, and I think they can take advantage of some of Newcastle's shortcomings. But yeah, really looking forward to the game. I think it is the game of the weekend for sure.
It is, yeah. And looking at the other fixtures, I mean, I don't think there's any real standout fixtures. It's almost, I mean, you talked about the Bournemouth Tottenham game. Will be an interesting game. I was very impressed with Tottenham last week. Very, very impressed. I think at the start or before the start of the season, in terms of the manager, I thought maybe he's not quite the right man. I think within the space of 2 games, I think he's absolutely the right man. And I'm really excited to see how Tottenham develop through the course of the season. And I sort of talked about Kane. I mean, it just is, you've got to be careful, because I mean, there's no way that you would ever say that losing Kane is going to improve a side. But I think what's happened certainly is certain mindsets have changed, and I think certain players have got a little bit more freedom, a little bit more responsibility, and I think that may work in Tottenham's favour in a bizarre sort of way, because you'd always sort of say, well, it's going to be a weaker side. But I just sort of think that Harry Kane going to Munich perhaps may be the best thing that's happened in a perverse sort of way.
You talked about this last time, when we discussed the Spurs win over Man United, and I think I took your point absolutely on board. It's not just, I think when I always say you've got to watch the games. You've got to watch the games to understand what it's about. And I think the team just looks like it's spreading its wings a little bit more. They're feeling a little bit more comfortable. It's not to say Harry Kane was a difficult customer or player in the dressing room. Absolutely not. But when you have one dominant personality in amongst the club, the aura of the likes of Harry Kane, through no fault of his own, it's just that naturally those kind of, I want to call them alpha personalities, but those personalities in terms of the rest of the squad don't necessarily kind of stand up. And sometimes you have to remove, or it's only once you remove that kind of big personality out of the dressing room that you start to see others take up that vacuum. And you've started to see some early signs of that with Bissouma coming on strong with the manager. It's the first time maybe that Spurs have really felt behind, like getting behind the manager. He talks well, that always helps. But I think, so that's the other thing, where previously you would say the number one personality at that club, yes, alongside Daniel Levy, has been Harry Kane. It's now where you think, hang on, is Ange Postecoglou able to really take the reins. So I'm really interested to see how they develop. Like you said, another big game for them at Bournemouth. The only other game I think, which isn't a big game in the grand scheme of things or on the face of it, but I think when you put all the totality of everything that's going on, I think Manchester United will want a morale boosting victory at Forest. You'd expect them to get it, but when you think about all the noise you just want to get your thoughts. Think about the takeover saga that continues to drag on. I mean, it's getting pretty boring now, whether or not it's going to happen or not. You think about some of the recent challenges off the field with Mason Greenwood as well. Then you've got some of the other issues with trying to shift on Maguire and McTominay and not quite being able to do so. Maguire seems like he might stay on unless there's some last minute shift in the final week of the transfer window. They obviously had the difficult defeat at Spurs, deservedly so. There were some question marks coming out of that about Mason Mount's position. Well, he's now injured. Luke Shaw's injured potentially for 2 weeks. They've got a number of injuries starting to pile up. And then there was obviously the challenging performance against Wolves. Yes, they won, but their fans would obviously expect a lot more. So there's a little bit, I would say, I don't see it as pressure because I think it's way too early. But there's just, I think there's a little bit of a pressing need just to put in a good performance and get a good win. I believe they're home. Maybe a clean sheet, a couple of goals, maybe Rashford back in amongst the goals. His body language hasn't been great. He's having to play up front, maybe not a position he's comfortable with. What's your thoughts? I just see a little bit of, I think it's a win that they need. I think that's what I would say.
I agree. I mean, you touched upon it right at the end about maybe Rashford's body language not being right. I think there is a little bit of disharmony at Manchester United at the moment, and even with the Maguire and McTominay, I'm not sure. I mean, there's very little that comes out in terms of when there's press conferences. I think Ten Hag plays his cards very close to his chest. You're not exactly sure what's going on, but I just sort of think what's happening is it's not great. It's not good. I mean, you've got two players now. If you feel that they are surplus to requirements, no problem with that at all. I mean, that's the prerogative of the club, the manager, but there has to be a little bit more. I mean, this is just, I mean, Harry Maguire has had a rough time, but McTominay, I think, has always been, he's been a very loyal servant. He's been a very low maintenance. And I think with Harry Maguire as well, I think he's not a difficult character. He's certainly struggled, I think, in games, but he's not a difficult character, or at least he doesn't appear to be. But the way from afar, it seems that they're being treated with not the respect that they deserve. I think they deserve a little bit more respect than that. So I don't have any issue if Ten Hag thinks that he does not see Maguire and McTominay as part of Manchester United going forward. No problem with that, but they deserve better treatment than this. I mean, it's like, I mean, we talked about it again last week where it was a game crying out for McTominay. Didn't get the game time. So I whether that sort of filters across the team, because these are two good characters. Now, obviously, when they're on the training pitch, it's not as if they don't talk to anybody. So I don't know whether that's just maybe just affecting performance, because Fernandes has been awful first two games. He's been shocking. Anthony, to me, is just, I cannot understand how on earth anybody could pay 80 million for that guy. I just honestly, I don't. I think he is a poor man's Rafinha. I've said that before, and I will say it continuously until he proves me wrong. Garnacho, again, I mentioned it in the last show. I think he's a decent player, but he's never, to me, he's not a starter yet. So I think there is maybe grumblings at Manchester United. The best cure is a win. And you're absolutely right. I think a win just perhaps just maybe just placates not just, I suppose, some of the players, but the fans as well. Because at the moment, I'm sure Man United fans are probably a little bit edgy, a little bit concerned, because performances have been dire. I mean, they got away with it. You're right. At Wolves, they should never have got a point, let alone 3 points. So you're right. A win is crucial for Manchester United.
Yeah, I think they'll want a win and a performance, won't they, Ayub? And that's what's been missing. They got the win at Wolves, which you felt the longer Wolves didn't maybe take advantage of those opportunities, Manchester United were going to make one of their own, and they duly did. But you're right, the Wolves definitely deserved a point. But you've got to put your chances away. I think the only thing I would say about the Maguire thing, I don't want to harp on it too much, Ayub, but in the same way, if you remember when we were talking in the summer about, or when Antonio Conte was relieved of his duties at Spurs, we said when boards appoint managers, we have to hold them accountable for doing their due diligence and making sure they've got the right manager on board, which means that when they then have to fire that manager, like Chelsea did with Potter, for example, they paid a lot of money to get him out of Chelsea, and then they fired him not so long afterwards. I always say there's a great deal of accountability on the board because they clearly got the wrong man. If they say he's not the right man to lead us, so what I'm saying is you can't have it both ways. And similarly, when Manchester United buy Harry Maguire from Leicester and then give him a contract extension or whatever it is, you can't then turn around as supporters, and I'm not saying Manchester United supporters are, but you can't turn around as supporters and say, oh, well, why is Harry Maguire not leaving? He should be leaving. Well, you tell me, if you're getting paid £220,000 a week, which is what his contract is, and he's got 2 years left on his contract, yes, the sportsman in all of us, the child in all of us, the supporter in all of us, go and play some football. But you ask me, is West Ham going to be paying him £220,000 a week? They're absolutely not, which means that the payoff that he was looking to negotiate with Manchester United, that's where it fell apart. He was looking to negotiate a payoff, terms couldn't be agreed, and he couldn't then make his move to West Ham because he was clearly wanting to be paid the difference because West Ham were not going to pay him £220,000 a week. So the question I have is, or the point I'm trying to make is, Man United knew when they gave a contract extension out to Harry Maguire that there's a good chance, if we're continuing to hire and fire managers, that the next manager might not quite fancy him, and we might be left with a player who's got security in terms of contract, who's getting paid a significant amount salary-wise, so there's no inherent incentive for him to move on. And yet now we are, or some fans are, arguing that he should be moving on if he wants to play football. He's probably thinking, why? I'll sit another year on the side. And yes, it's not good for him because he's had a tough year last year, and you would think his England spot is definitely in jeopardy with another season on the sidelines. But I just say, where's the accountability on Manchester United? You were the team that, and this is the reason why clubs don't just go around paying willy-nilly in terms of wages when we as fans just say, oh, just pay the guy who wants a new contract, give him a new contract. It's the reason why Liverpool and Salah went on for quite some time, if you remember, because the argument is, well, what happens if his form falls off when we're paying him £350,000-400,000 a week? So it's just, these are the kind of measured balance to use we need to think about when clubs are negotiating with players or negotiating with other clubs for fees, I would say. So it's just one of those. I don't see any incentive for him. If he's on £220,000 a week, why is he taking a pay cut to go somewhere else? I mean, he's got 2 years left on his deal. So United will have to be smart with that negotiation to get him out of the club, and they'll have to pay him off or subsidise his wages at his future club. But I'm with you. Coming back to the game, I don't think they just need a win. I think they want a morale-boosting victory. They've obviously got Arsenal game week 4. So they'll want a win going into that game. So let's see. But I do fancy him. I do fancy him at home to Forest, surely.
They will do. They will do. I mean, I'm not sure about which direction Forest are going, but I think they want to challenge Manchester United. Right, that's a preview of the games today and over the weekend. There was an interesting incident or a comment that Mike Dean made about a game where it was Spurs and who were they playing?
Chelsea and Spurs at Stamford Bridge.
Yeah, and it was he was on VAR duty, and it was a late goal by Kane, but there was various incidents that preceded the goal. Mike Dean on VAR, in my opinion, just bottled it. I mean, I think his defence is, to me, it's so weak that it's almost embarrassing. But Uwais, if you could outline the story, and then maybe we'll have a quick discussion on Mike Dean and refereeing in general, which is a bugbear of mine.
Absolutely, and I will just lay it out in terms of what happened, what the comment was, who he was discussing it with, and then give you the flow if that's okay. You just got to get your thoughts first. So Mike Dean was on the podcast with Simon Jordan, which is a fun podcast. I do like it. He's interviewed many kind of former boxers, as well as a few other kind of sporting personalities. But he had Mike Dean on, who's now, I believe, part of the Gillette Soccer Saturday crew, I believe, working for Sky Sports.
Yeah, he's stealing a living over there now.
Again, some of the views shared on the Just Onside podcast are Ayub's and Ayub's only. But no, I mean, so he was on that interview. But it's funny you make a good point, actually, because at the start of the podcast, Mike Dean or Simon Jordan not only welcomes him, but is grateful for having Mike Dean on there. But he talks about how he had previously asked for Mike Dean to come on, but whilst he was under the guidance of the Referees Association or working under the purview of the PGMOL, his request was rejected because they didn't really want to put forth a current employee on a I guess a podcast or something that was going to be shared out there. So, but now he's not under that, and he's just working for Sky Sports. He was able to come on, but the podcast was a general discussion about Mike Dean, his career, how he has come across in terms of his refereeing personality. So it wasn't just about this one incident. This one incident was discussed about 40 minutes into the podcast, which I think was about an hour and 10 minutes long. And the incident in question, Ayub, which has got the social media channels talking. We do have to be careful. One of the things you and I at least pride ourselves on is not blowing things out of proportion when they don't need to be, being measured, being balanced. And when I listened to the whole podcast, which I did, this was a very small snippet. There wasn't really any follow-up to it. So it didn't necessarily cause any furore for Simon Jordan to follow up on. And the question was about where Anthony Taylor, I think, was the referee early on last season. I think it was, it would have been last season, because Tuchel would have started the season at Chelsea. And if you remember, famously, it was the game where Tuchel and Conte had their spat on the sideline when Tuchel was asking Conte to look him in the eye when he shakes his hand. It got a little feisty.
Yeah. It was a cracker. It was that. I love that. I love that.
I'm sure you do. But it was a great game. Chelsea played Spurs absolutely off the park in the first half of the game. I remember the game vividly. Chelsea genuinely played some great stuff. But in the end, it was 2-1. Chelsea were leading. Spurs got a late corner. And I think from the original corner, what have you, I think it was Romero who grabbed Cucurella's hair. I don't think it was from the corner that it resulted in, that resulted in the goal. It was the corner just before that, and I think the referee pulled it to one side or just had a word or something like that. And anyway, long story short, is that Anthony Taylor was the referee. The corner was swung in. Harry Kane swooped and scored. And the question was that just before in the first corner or something along those lines or what have you, and I can't remember if it was the same corner, but Romero again grabbed Cucurella's hair, and it was a clear foul, to be fair. He prevented Cucurella from challenging for the ball or getting towards the ball, shall we say. I mean, Cucurella did make the most of it, as is often his want. But what Mike Dean spoke about is on the podcast, and this is where I'll give you the floor, Ayub, is that because of the nature of the game Anthony Taylor he'd booked Thomas Tuchel and Antonio Conte earlier on in the game. It was a very kind of fiercely contested game. Both teams, as you can imagine, Chelsea, Spurs do have a little bit of history, which will be interesting this season when Pochettino goes back to play his former club. But it was a very tight affair, great game. But because of the nature of the game, the fact that he would have had to send Anthony Taylor to the screen to review the incident and what have you, he said he just felt sorry for him, essentially, in a nutshell, and that because Anthony Taylor's a mate, he just simply didn't want to do that to him, because he would have been sending him to the screen, towards the touchline, where there was a lot of, let's say, anxiety, a lot of stress, there was a little bit of a high temperament in amongst the sideline, with all the kind of the benches and what have you. And essentially, he admits as much that you used the word bottle, he didn't use that word, but in a roundabout way, he did conclude that actually I just felt sorry for him. I didn't want to do that to him. Now he accepts that it was a mistake on his behalf, but the big question, and this is where I'll ask you the question. The question is, when you've got a VAR official making a decision based on emotion, as opposed to simply just judging the decision for what it is, that in some ways brings the integrity of the game into question. Now, what's really funny and what's contradictory about Mike Dean, I'll come on to it, is that he talks about how he was one of those referees that if there was a penalty in the first minute, I'll give it. If it's a penalty in the 98th minute, I'll give it. He was talking about how he had and he used a different word, but let's just say he had the guts to give penalties or red cards or big decisions no matter what. Yet when it came to it, when he was playing, when he was taking up the role of VAR, he simply just felt sorry for Anthony Taylor and didn't want to send him to the screen, even though he accepts it was probably a foul. And if a referee goes to the screen, 99 times out of 100, he's going to reverse that decision. It cost Chelsea that day. Who knows? One of the reasons why Thomas Tuchel lost his job in the end.
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts on that incident and what Mike Dean said on the Simon Jordan podcast?
It's the bit that you said right at the end, which I was going to sort of pick up on if you hadn't said it, about Thomas Tuchel. Now, obviously, that's not the game that was the end. But it has an impact. It has an impact. I mean, if Chelsea win that game, you don't know what happens in the following game. So it's such. I mean, the stakes are so high. I mean, it cannot. I mean, I think Mike Dean. I mean, I'm not sure what his thoughts are now. If you were to ask him whether I mean, in private, if you asked him, if you had that interview again with Simon Jordan, would you say that again? Because I think it was almost it that's the good thing with Simon Jordan. I think he's he is. I mean, he polarizes opinions. He's not everybody's cup of tea, but I do like him. I think he's interesting. If nothing else, he's always interesting, and I think he's developed as a really good interviewer. He always talks about himself quite often, but he does get things out, and I think this is an interviewer who's perhaps got his interviewee to say something that perhaps is something that he may reflect on and think, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And I think that's the worry for me. How many times? I mean, Mike Dean is an experienced individual. He's an experienced referee. If he's capable of showing emotion, and really what we want is, we don't mind emotion, but there are certain times when it should be emotionless. And that's my fear. That's my concern. I mean, I've always said that British refereeing, English referees are awful. They're shocking. I think the standard is substandard. The league deserves better than the rubbish that we have, and this just adds to it. I mean, I was annoyed. I was angry. The Football Association has to do something about this. It has to do something about this. I mean, I've been a long advocate of getting ex-pros to be officials in very much the same way that cricket has. Virtually every single cricket umpire is an ex-pro. Different types of officiating, but ultimately, I think if you've got an ex-pro, maybe straight away there's an immediate confidence. They know their game. So at least it should be tried. The fact they've never done that, they've never tried to invest in that, to me is extremely disappointing. This adds fuel to the fire. I think what Mike Dean has said, it does question not only the officiating, but VAR as well. How many other times have VAR officials acted on emotions? Because they're pals at the end of the day. These are it's a refereeing club. These are guys who are not just referees, but they're obviously part of a brotherhood. So maybe, I suppose, there's been decisions in the past as well. But these decisions, if they get wrong, are too costly. And as I said, it's probably too harsh to say that cost Tuchel the job. But I think it contributed to Tuchel losing the job. So for me, it should now begin a conversation again about refereeing and maybe trying to find a solution, because at the moment, the league does not deserve the rubbish that is officiating.
You make a couple of points which I'm going to circle back on, Ayub. It's funny about referees. I often wonder about the neutrality and impartiality of referees, because with VAR, because they're away, and initially when it was introduced, it was in Stockley Park, and you didn't see them. You just heard about, it's Stockley Park and it's VAR, but they were hidden away, right? There wasn't much like, who are they? Who is it? And what have you? Now in games they talk about it, right? That this person's on VAR. For example, Liverpool against Bournemouth, famously Paul Tierney was on VAR duty. Obviously, Jurgen Klopp and Paul Tierney have some history, but it's announced, right, that this person's on VAR and what have you. And maybe that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think anytime transparency is generally received well for the most part. But I often wonder about neutrality, and something like this definitely questions that. I was thinking, for example, like, I don't know if you remember the Carabao Cup final, and I hope I'm remembering this right, but Carabao Cup final contested between Manchester United and Newcastle, you'll remember. And if you remember, I think Michael Oliver was part of the Newcastle fans travelling to Wembley, because I think he's a Newcastle fan. I know he's a Geordie. I'm sure it's Newcastle. And he went to the game. Nothing wrong with that. Got no qualms with that whatsoever. He's allowed a life. It's his personal business. Got no qualms. But then I questioned to myself, how many times over the years when Newcastle were fighting relegation was he refereeing other teams that may have been in around? Because if he feels that strongly about going to a game, I think Mike Dean's famously a Tranmere Rovers supporter.
He's all right. Yeah,
but like, but
he was never going to have a conflict of interest.
Fair enough. John Aldridge, famous times. But I think about where Newcastle have been there before, right? Fighting relegation. And it doesn't have to be fighting relegation, but let's just say, and then let's say you're Michael Oliver and you're refereeing games between other relegation rivals. Is there some subconscious in there? And I'm not even blaming him. I'm just saying that if you feel that strongly about, let's say, one of your teams where you travel to the Carabao Cup final, which is what you did, I'm sure it was, to the point where then you think, well, hang on, how does that work when you're refereeing? Like I said, I mean, Newcastle last year fighting for top four, or maybe this year when they're fighting for top four, and let's say game week 37, and they need Liverpool or Arsenal to drop points, and Michael Oliver's refereeing that game. I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form he would do anything to the contrary. I just think there's something in all of us that's subconscious where you're thinking, I've got a preferred result here, to be fair. So if there's any way I can. So I think not only is it a case of there has to be impartiality, as you know, it's often the case when you say about justice, not only does justice have to be done, justice has to be seen to be done as well. So it's about how there has to be the perception of impartiality, which is why Michael Oliver can never referee Newcastle games. Now, of course, devil's advocate, someone might say, well, hang on, if he's never going to referee any Newcastle games and he's never going to referee any games that might impact Newcastle's ability to succeed or fail, then he might not referee any games and you'll never have a referee who can referee any games whatsoever. But I think you take my point.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the one really interesting point that you made about the interview. And you're right. I think when you listen to the interview, I think it caught Simon Jordan unawares as well, because he didn't really follow up on it. And Simon Jordan's a smart cookie, to your point. And he's had difficult customers on his podcast. He asked some tough questions. He's had Carl Froch on. He's had Matthew Letitia on. I mean, he really puts it on you. There's no qualms. So I think it caught him. And you're right. I think Mike Dean was so comfortable because this was a bit of a PR piece for him as well, because he spoke about how I hope this podcast has helped change perceptions about me. But I think he felt so comfortable. I think he just volunteered the information.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right, Ayub. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And I think by that point, obviously, Howard Webb's probably thinking, well, just as well, he's not part of the PGMOL now, because that's really given me a lot of things to answer to. And I agree with you. I think the thing with refereeing is, Ayub, in the end, it's about arriving at the right decision. It's a very simple, and all the referees, I believe, 100% are trying to get to the right decision. I think what happens every now and again with our sport that we love is that there's an incident or there's a situation that you just think, how on earth can this happen with all the resource in the world, with all the information, with all the angles, with all the images? I'll come back to it. You've got McAllister red card. Everyone on their mum knows that it's not a red card. Mike Dean on Gillette Soccer Saturday straight away said, yeah, it's a red card. But we know how that aged because he's now had his red card rescinded. So how much credibility is to his voice? It was clearly not a red card. You don't need to be clever about it. It's just obvious. You think famously back to the Brentford Arsenal game, Ayub, how can you forget to check the last header back across goal for Ivan Toney to score? You think, hang on, we understand the psychology. He spent so much time checking the first few incidents in the free kick. He's forgotten to check the last bit, which is maybe I should check the pass to the goal to see if that was offside. I mean, basics, and maybe under pressure that causes errors. But there are some situations that happen where you think, how this in the highest league, in the most in the highest stakes, in a $1 billion league, this cannot afford to happen. So do I agree with you that the refereeing standard is shocking? I don't. I think it's better than that. But there are times when you think, how are they arriving at some of these decisions? There's been massive question marks. They've been quite strong with the yellow cards, with the time wasting, with the red cards. You hope that settles. You think that would start to self-police itself, you would imagine. But it'll be interesting to see, because I do think referees, and we'll probably come on to it in future episodes, what could we do about it? Could we, the post-match interviews, etc., blah, blah, blah. But I do think it'll be interesting to see if there's any more future major incidents, how that's received, and whether or not there's any recriminations from this Mike Dean interview. Maybe it'll just get washed over because he's not part of the referees fraternity now. But I thought it was quite an alarming and a worrying point. And I can't imagine Chelsea fans being too enamored with Mike Dean, or generally the referees association themselves, to think, well, hang on, he felt sorry for him, and we lost potentially 2 points. I mean, Chelsea in the end went on to have a disastrous season, but to your point, games early on often can set a trend for how the season's going to go. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it'll be interesting to see if there's anything that comes off this, whether it becomes a bit of a story, whether it doesn't, but it was definitely an interesting soundbite.
It certainly was. And knowing, I suppose, the FA, they probably just won't do anything about it as usual, because this is an issue that should have been addressed a long time ago. But we can talk about this for hours and hours. But time is pressing. It's Friday. People are going out Friday night, so we better call it a day.
You've already got your gilet on.
So you can tell I'm ready for action. All right. So as always, viewers, thank you so much for supporting the channel, watching the channel, making comments, contributing. So as always, I'll ask you to please subscribe if you haven't. Smash a like as always. Hit the notification bell. And the next one we'll be recording, I think, on Monday. So hopefully that will drop. What we're trying to do now is record and maybe 2-3 hours later drop the video. So there's a certain immediacy about it. So as always, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. And until the next time, stay on side.
Don't stray off.